So it all started with a molt. In 2019, a volunteer conducting a beach survey in Drayton Harbor near Blaine found a crab molt. Unlike any of our native species, what she found was the molt of an invasive European green crab. What she might not have realized at the time was that led to the discovery of some of the largest populations of green crab, not only in Whatcom County, but in Puget Sound as well. And green crabs are considered one of the world's worst invasive species by a lot of scientists and researchers, and there's quite a few reasons that are really applicable to Whatcom County. First, green crabs can absolutely decimate eelgrass beds when they're in really large, dense populations. And considering the cultural and economic and just environmental importance of eelgrass and all the eelgrass beds that are in Whatcom County, this is something that we don't want to have happen. Green crabs can outcompete with native crabs, including our juvenile Dungeness crabs and shore crabs. And so while a Dungie this size is probably not going to have a hard time competing with a green crab, but a young Dungeness is going to have a hard time with competing for food and resources with an adult green crab. And this, again, is really important for our recreational and tribal fishers. And green crabs can lead to declines in clam, mussel, and oyster fisheries. With all of the shellfish industry that we have in Whatcom County, this again is something that we want to keep on our radar. And you might be wondering, well, how did they even get to the Salish Sea? How did they get to Washington to begin with? Well, after getting over to the West Coast in the early 90s, they started migrating up the West Coast and found themselves in Barkley Sound in 1999. And from there, traveled through the Strait of Juan de Fuca into Sook Basin in 2012. That population in Sook Basin actually prompted the creation of the Washington Sea Grant Crab Team, which is a volunteer-based green crab monitoring program. And so they help to get baseline data across a lot of different sites within the Salish Sea. And that was really perfect timing for them to become established because green crabs continued to travel throughout the Salish Sea and were found in limited incidences in Westcott Bay and Padilla Bay in 2016, and in larger populations at Macaw Reservation and Dungeness Spit in 2017. And in 2019, just like I mentioned with the story, green crabs were found in pretty large populations, not only in Whatcom County, but in Skagit County as well. And just diving into Whatcom County a little bit more specifically and giving you some numbers from this past season. And so Whatcom County actually has some pretty high concentrations of green crabs compared to other larger sites in the Salish Sea in Puget Sound. And so green crabs in Whatcom County have been found in Drayton Harbor, Birch Bay, Lummi Sea Pond, and Squalicum Harbor, which is in Bellingham Bay. And before I dive too deep into those numbers, I wanted to give an overview of the different types of trapping efforts we in the green crab world conduct. So the first is that early detection and monitoring that the crab team does. And so that's really, they're collecting that baseline data and just being the first eyes on the ground. And just, they are really looking to find any evidence of green crab. Second type is opportunistic or exploratory or prospecting trapping. And this is what we do a lot in Birch Bay or Squalicum Harbor, areas that might not have really big populations of green crab yet, or areas we might not have ever gone to, just to get an idea of where green crabs are, and just to make sure we're not missing any hotspots of green crab activity in our trapping efforts. And third is dedicated removal. And that's what we do in Drayton Harbor and in Lummi Sea Pond. And that is really just dedicated efforts to remove as many green crabs as we can. And how we do these different types of trapping, we use 3 different types of traps. So minnows and fukuis are used for all of those different trapping types, and shrimps are really used predominantly for removal trapping efforts. And we use these different types of traps because they collect slightly different data. So our minnow traps are going to collect really small crabs. So the juvenile green crabs are going to be found in minnows, and we'll find larger crab sizes in fukui and shrimp traps. We can also place shrimp traps in deeper water compared to minnows and fukuis. So diving into the numbers a little bit more. So the site with the fewest crabs caught this year was Birch Bay. And we thankfully only caught 1 crab here at the mouth of Terrell Creek. And we set in 2021, this past season, we set up over 300 traps, caught only 1 green crab, and our catch rate for that, which is really the metric that we use to understand what's happening across our different sites, our catch rate was 0.3. So that means for every 100 traps that we set, we only caught 1/3 of a crab. We'll continue to trap here in Birch Bay just to make sure that we're not missing anything and we're not allowing any large population to take hold. In Squalicum Harbor, we first trapped it this past season and set over 200 traps and caught 6 green crabs. And that was a catch rate of 1.4, which was a little bit higher than our Birch Bay efforts, and something that I think we'll be continuing to look at in the future. This is something that we definitely want to keep our eye on a little bit more. The one issue with Squalicum Harbor is that it's in a very populated area, and it's Bellingham Bay, and we had some issues with people tampering with our traps and actually stole a couple traps on one of the occasions that we trapped. So with Squalicum Harbor and Bellingham Bay in general, we're really going to have to improve our outreach efforts just to make sure people realize that what we're doing it's good. It's meant to be removing an invasive and to hopefully reduce the number of people tampering with any of the traps. And Drayton Harbor, this is where we do a lot of removal efforts, and the removal efforts have been working actually. So we started really intense removal efforts in 2020 and captured 253 green crabs. And so that was almost 8 crabs for every 100 traps that we set. This past season, we set over 5,000 traps and caught 146 green crabs, and which is about 3 crabs for every 100 traps that were set. And so that to us is really showing how these dedicated efforts can help to reduce these larger populations. And I wanted to get into those the efforts just a little bit more in depth for you. So this is Drayton Harbor, and the yellow dots are sites that we consider hotspots of green crab activity. And this is where we have put in just our really dedicated removal efforts on those areas. So our efforts are really consistent, frequent trapping. And just to break that down a little bit more. So at the Pillars site, which is right next to the Blaine Marina, this past season, we used both minnow fukui traps, and in September and October, we used shrimp traps. So in total, we caught 30 crabs from just that site alone, but the shrimp traps were very effective for us there. The minnows and fukuis with a catch rate of 1.6 still was pretty good. Dakota Creek is actually the biggest hotspot of all of our hotspots in Drayton Harbor. And we ended up capturing a total of 83 crabs from the mouth of Dakota Creek alone. And shrimp traps, again, were very, very effective. in Dakota Creek, and we'll continue to be using those in this upcoming season as well. And finally, California Creek, we only captured 10, and this is actually the same site where a crab team does their work as well. And again, that shrimp trap has really worked well for us in this past season. And I think that's something going forward that we'll continue to use all 3 different trap types, because they obviously all seem to work, but really integrate the shrimp traps a lot more into our work for the entirety of the season. And with that, I wanted to pass it over to Bobby to talk about the efforts that Lummi Natural Resources is doing in Lummi Bay.
Thanks, Allie. Again, I'm Bobby Bazell. I'm the green crab biologist with Lummi Natural Resources. And since last summer, I have been leading the trapping program on Lummi Reservation tidelands. So I'll give you a little background. The Lummi Reservation is just south of Drayton Harbor and Birch Bay, where partner efforts have been going on, as Allie just talked about. On the Lummi Reservation, it's characterized by expansive tidelands, their waterways, and there's around 11,000 acres of nearshore habitat, which includes salt marshes along the shoreline. And this provides ample habitat for European green crab. Lummi Bay is just to the north of Lummi Peninsula, which is that long, elongated piece of land on the right-hand side map. And so Lummi Bay is just to the north, and then to the south is Bellingham Bay, which also contains the Nooksack River estuary. Within Lummi Bay, there is the Lummi Sea Pond, which you can see an outline of it in the middle of Lummi Bay. And this is a 750-acre man-made aquaculture pond that was built in the 1970s. And its purpose was originally for shellfish aquaculture and salmon. Next. To give you an idea of what Lummi Sea Pond looks like, it's mainly characterized by a shallow protected intertidal zone. The sea pond generally gets no deeper than 5 to 6 feet. And it has 2 different types of shoreline. To the north is a marshy bank, as you can see on the picture of the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, gives you an idea of the rest of the perimeter of the sea pond, which is a rocky dike road that extends 3 miles around the entire sea pond. During extreme low tides or heightened or warmer air temperatures, some of that shoreline will become more exposed, but due to tide gates to the north and south of the sea pond, the water level stays fairly consistent inside the sea pond throughout the entire year. Next. Trapping effort for the Lummi Reservation began in 2019, and this is when there was the first detection, as Allie mentioned, in Lummi Bay. There were a multitude of different sites tested and explored during 2019 in October and November of that year, which included Lummi Bay, up the branches of the Lummi River, as well as Portage Bay, which is not pictured here clearly, but is just south of the Lummi Peninsula. As I said, several different spots tested, but only 2 of those locations contained green crab, which included Sandy Point Heights to the north, which is that northernmost red point. At this location is a tide gate, which is between Lummi Bay and that branch of the Lummi River, and green crab were captured on the bay side of that tide gate. Now, further to the south in Lummi Sea Pond is where the majority of crab were captured in 2019. A total of 64 were captured between the two sites, but 41 of those were removed from Lummi Sea Pond. This led to the tribe pushing for a resolution that allowed a massive response from Lummi Natural Resource staff to pursue removal efforts, as well as it included a way of collaboration with other agencies, including Washington Sea Grant and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The following year, with the push for more removal effort, nearly 2,500 green crab were removed from Lummi Sea Pond alone in 2020. Next. In 2021, almost all of Lummi Natural Resource staff allocated trapping effort into Lummi Sea Pond. There was limited staffing for the first several months of last year. But in July, there was a designated green crab team that was hired, including myself, a biologist, and 2 technicians. There was also occasional help with staff from Fish and Wildlife before that point. Now, when we were hired, we started readying the shrimp traps that Ali talked about earlier, and we started adding those into the sea pond. We started with about 40 to 50 of them between July and August. And it was during this time where we saw heightened catch rates in the Fukui and minnow traps. So not only were the shrimp traps effective right off the get-go, but we were also seeing increased catch rates in the traps that have been routinely used in the past. So in response to these heightened catch rates, by September, we had, along with more than 170 shrimp traps in the sea pond. We also had 5 to 6 staff from Fish and Wildlife, Washington Sea Grant, and Northwest Streets Commission, which includes Ali as part of that team. And so as we pushed for more effort, obviously there was more crab that were being captured, but what was even more significant was the increase in those catch rates among all of the trap types. Especially for our shrimp traps. As the year continued on, effort did subside a little bit because of limited staffing, but overall our catch rates remained pretty high for a few months there. Next. Here is a table of the trapping effort over the last 3 years for Lummi Reservation tidelands, and specifically the Lummi Sea Pond. If there was anything that we've learned in this past year, is that Lummi Sea Pond has been the perfect incubator. It was designed as a nursery habitat. So it does make sense that we've seen exponential growth in green crab populations. Here for the Fukui and minnow traps is a table of captures over the years to give you side-by-side comparison. In 2019, you can see we had the 41 captures that changed to in 2020 to nearly 2,500 green crab with slightly higher catch rates. But not the most clear distinction there, only because, but excuse me, when you look at them peak mean weekly, that's when we start to see that jump in catch rates. In 2021, more than 15,000 green crab had been captured in just the Fukuis and minnows alone. Now, I've sussed out the shrimp trap data because this is where we caught the bulk of our green crab, more than 70,000 green crab, which brought our total over 85,000 green crab total for 2021. Heightened effort, but then our peak mean weekly catch rate was at 1,800. So more than 1,800 green crab per 100 trap sets. Next.
Bobby, forgive me. We've got about 3 minutes or so to wrap up, and then 5 minutes for questions.
Sounds good. Next steps for Lummi Natural Resources, we have a 2-tiered plan. One is building trapping capacity. So for the short term, we're trying to just remove as many crab as we can, as fast as we can. That'll be done with buying more traps. See in this left-hand picture is our green crab headquarters with lots of traps that are being readied for use in the sea pond. We plan to contract Lummi fishers to work specifically in the sea pond to help us remove these green crab. And then in the long term, we're looking for a long-term management plan that's going to help optimize the use of the sea pond for the future, as well as deter any establishment of invasives, including green crab and other invasives alike. So lots of restoration and also research needs. We currently understand that the concern with the Dungeness crab fishery, especially for Lummi fishers who heavily depend on that. And so although there isn't any evidence that the Dungeness crab fishery has been affected, we do need baseline surveys for juvenile Dungeness crab moving forward to really understand if there is an impact or if there will be an impact. And next. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that European green crab do not know bounds. They do not understand borders. They are going to establish where they want to establish. And this effort that we've had within Whatcom County and the Lummi Reservation could not have been achieved without the collaboration across multiple agencies, communities, and the countless volunteers. So we really just want to express our gratitude to everybody who's been a part of this big push for green crab removal and detection over the last few years. Next. And with that, we are happy to take questions. Thank you, everyone.
Allie, Bobby, thank you for your presentation. There are some questions in the chat, starting with John Thompson. Can you guys see those, or would you like me to read them to you?
Allie, you want to take this first question?
Yeah. Yeah, so focus on shallow exploring areas. So it does reflect habitat preference. And it's kind of a mix of both for your question. So some of it is that we have limited access on the creeks. We do try to trap within the creek system itself. And we have trapped in deeper waters. The deeper waters within Drayton Harbor are only accessible by boat. And so that is an access issue as well. But the three areas that I highlighted in the yellow dots are the areas where we have been finding the majority of our green crabs. And so while we do, just with prospecting, trap as many areas as we can get to, our focus is those main spots that happen to be in those shallow areas. And I guess we can I'll take the second question as well there. Are you keeping track of other crab species being caught and looking for patterns there too? We do catch, so any other of the bycatch that we find in any of our traps, in Drayton Harbor, Birch Bay, and Squalicum Harbor, we do record all of the species that we find. So if there's other crabs, other fish, anything that happens to get inside those traps, we actually do record the amount and species. I know, Eleanor, you might do things a little differently. You want to?
Yeah, for us with prospecting, we will do, recording all the bycatch species, but when it comes to removal efforts, and also, we are catching so many green crab in the sea pond that it would greatly slow down the process of removal efforts if we were keeping track of all the bycatch. So there was originally tracking of that, but moving to removal, we've had to deprioritize the recording of bycatch species.
And the next question, is there a push for sea grant and other monitoring programs to adopt the shrimp trap strategy, or is that mostly for eradication efforts? It is mostly for eradication efforts. Shrimp traps are also very big and difficult to carry around. And whereas the minnows and fukui traps, you can put 15 fukui traps because they can fold down onto one pack to be able to carry out everywhere. And so in minnows as well, they can stack, and there's just a lot easier ways to carry those traps. Shrimp traps are very difficult to wield about, and it would make it really difficult to add that into a monitoring program, because not only are you having to carry your minnow and fukui traps to keep the consistency going, having to add one of those in, it would be very difficult. Most of the time, the trapping that we did in Drayton with the shrimp traps, we were only able to carry 3 or 4 at a time. And that's one of the reasons the shrimp trap numbers are so low. I know at LNR, you're using shrimp traps a lot, but they get left out.
Yeah, we have a semi-permanent array and transects of shrimp traps that remain in the sea pond full time. They really only come out for some repair or just getting moved around to other parts of the pond.
I'm going to jump in there and thank both of our speakers for their time and everyone for listening and their questions. And it is 9:59, so I'm going to end our session here. Thank you again, Al.